My name is Isolde Harriman, and I will never forget the night my father looked me straight in the eye and said, loud enough for the whole room to hear, "Only important people are invited, not you." The laughter around him stung worse than the words. He wasn't joking. He meant it. At 75, standing tall in front of his friends at the Fisherman's Hall, my father decided to erase me from his story, as if decades of service in uniform, deployments, and lives I had held together on blood-soaked ground counted for nothing. That sentence cracked something inside me, the same way it had when I was a girl and he told everyone my brother was the Harriman worth bragging about. Years later, nothing had changed. In that moment, I wasn't his daughter, I was his punchline. What no one in that hall knew yet was that I had just been promoted to colonel in the United States Air Force. And what my father had tried to keep small was about to be pulled into the light, in front of everyone he'd worked so hard to impress. When I came back to New Bedford, the salt still clung to the streets the way it always had, heavy and familiar, like a town that never forgot its own past. I hadn't been home in years, not since the military swallowed most of my adult life, and yet nothing about my father's house had changed. The same clapboard siding weathered by storms, the same brass ship's bell by the door, the same silence that filled every corner whenever I walked inside. He was in the living room polishing a wooden model of a schooner, rubbing at its mast with the kind of focus he used to give to his fishing boats. His hands, though older and slower, still carried the authority of a man who expected the world to bend around him. I asked him about the birthday party, careful, almost hopeful, if he needed anything from me, if there was a way I could help. He didn't look up. His voice was flat, deliberate, sharpened by years of knowing exactly how to cut. "Only important people are invited, not you." The words landed like salt in an old wound, the same wound that had never healed. I felt my jaw tighten. Years of uniform and chain of command had trained me to answer in control, not in anger. So I did what came naturally. "Copy," I said quietly. He went back to polishing the mast, as though I hadn't spoken, as though I wasn't even in the room. I stood there long enough to feel the weight of his dismissal press against my ribs, then turned toward the door. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to win from him. I decided I'd leave a single gift, a framed photograph of my mother, the one thing that had always belonged to me, and walk away before the band struck its first note. He thought he had drawn the line of who counted as important. What he didn't know, what no one in that hall yet knew, was that tonight those words would unravel, and the story he had written about me would never hold again. My earliest memories of comfort belonged to my mother, Eleanor. She had the kind of quiet strength that made rooms feel safe, even when the storm outside was inside our house. She died when I was 20, her heart giving out after years of carrying burdens too heavy to name. Before she left, she pressed a chipped porcelain teacup into my hands, its rim uneven, its handle worn smooth. "Don't let your father make you small," she whispered, as though it were a commandment, not advice. I've carried those words the way some people carry scripture. My father never wasted his breath on me the way he did on Elliot. Elliot was his pride, his golden boy, law school in Boston, a polished suit, the kind of son a man brags about down at the docks. I remember dinners where Dad leaned back in his chair, retelling Elliot's courtroom victories, his voice rising with pride. Meanwhile, my mother quietly slipped the best piece of fish onto my plate, her eyes saying what she never dared out loud. "I see you." By 19, I couldn't breathe under that roof anymore. I enlisted in the Air Force and chose medical service, patching up the broken, standing in the space between life and death. In Afghanistan, dust caked my uniform as I knelt over a young private torn open by shrapnel, my palm pressed against his chest, blood seeping between my fingers. And I said the only thing that mattered. "Stay with me, breathe." He did. Moments like that turned me into a leader, not by title, but by necessity. Yet here, back home, none of that ever seemed to count. To my father, I was still just the daughter who left. To the town. I was Arthur Harriman's girl who went off to do something vague with the military. Elliot was the one they pointed to with pride. I was the afterthought. And beneath every handshake, every smile, I could feel it. The quiet dismissal that said, "She's not the important one." The fisherman's hall buzzed with voices and clinking glasses the night of my father's celebration. I walked in wearing my dress blues, each ribbon measured to regulation, polished shoes reflecting the weak glow of the neon sign above. The smell of salt and old nets clung to coats draped over chairs, and a sheet cake on the corner table sagged under melting frosting. I moved toward the donation box, envelope in hand, ready to slide it in and disappear. Then my father stepped into my path. His smile stretched wide for the audience gathered around him. His voice carried just enough to reach every ear nearby. "Only important people are invited, not you." The words fell heavy, silencing the room for a breath. Then came the careful clatter of glasses lifted, the forced murmur of conversation meant to cover the sting. My chest tightened in that familiar way, the instinct to vanish before anyone else felt awkward on my behalf. My hand brushed against the challenge coin in my pocket, the metal warm from my grip, a reminder of who I really was. I turned, ready to walk out. That's when I felt it, a firm hand catching my sleeve. A calm, steady voice rang out, clear enough to cut through every pretense in the hall. "Ma'am, this way." I lifted my eyes and saw her, General Catherine Duval, 4 stars on her shoulder, the woman who had mentored me through years of service. She stood tall, unbothered, every bit the embodiment of authority and grace. The room froze. My father's face blanched, his practiced smile cracking. For the first time in a lifetime, I wasn't small, I was undeniable. When General Duval's hand closed around mine, and she guided me toward the stage, the fisherman's hall seemed to hold its breath. The hum of chatter cut off. Chairs creaked as men shifted uneasily. Old fishermen who'd weathered 1,000 storms removed their caps, pressing them to their chests. A few younger men straightened their ties, as if neatness might shield them from the shift in air. The weight in the room thickened into something close to reverence. Then her voice carried, firm and unshaken. "Tonight, we recognize Colonel Isolde Harriman." The title rang through the hall like a bell. A ripple of murmurs spread, stunned and uncertain. Then came a sound that cut deeper than applause. The sharp cack, cack of glass against wood as a veteran at the back tapped his mug in quiet tribute. The room fell still again, as if acknowledging a truth too large to ignore. Across the tables, my father sat stiff, his mouth twisting into that half-smile he wore when he thought he was clever. "Well," he said loudly enough for his circle of friends, "looks like she fooled some people in Washington." But no laughter followed. The joke collapsed into silence, hanging in the air like smoke no one wanted to breathe. He looked around, waiting for support, but found none. That was the moment the ground shifted. The narrative he had clung to for years slipped out of his hands. For the first time, the story of my life was no longer his to tell. It was mine, spoken aloud, undeniable, sealed in the respectful quiet of the people who had heard it. General Duval wasn't finished. She spoke again, this time softer, but every syllable carried. She announced the creation of the Eleanor Harriman Memorial Scholarship, named for my mother, to help children of service members pursue their future. The words struck like a tide pulling me back. I saw my mother's gentle smile, felt the chipped porcelain rim of her teacup against my fingers, heard her whisper, "Don't let your father make you small." The hall stirred, some people nodding in approval, others exchanging glances. And then Elliot rose abruptly, his chair scraping the wooden floor like a warning. His voice was sharp, almost triumphant in its bitterness. "This night belongs to Dad, not you. You always have to steal the spotlight." Gasps, whispers. The low rumble of discomfort swirled through the room. A few of my father's friends clapped Elliot on the shoulder, their loyalty quick and shallow. Others turned their eyes toward me, searching, weighing. I steadied myself the only way I knew how. my thumb pressed against the challenge coin in my pocket, its edges biting into my skin. The same grounding ritual I had used in combat, under fire, when panic clawed at the edges of my vision. My breath slowed. General Duval didn't raise her voice. She simply turned her head and fixed Elliot with a look that had silenced rooms filled with generals. No words, just her gaze. And under that weight, my brother's tone faltered, his chest rising shallow, his voice shrinking into itself. But the damage was done. The room had split open. Some aligned themselves with my father and brother, clinging to the old story of who mattered and who did not. Others leaned subtly toward me, toward the truth that had finally been spoken aloud. The private fracture of my family had become a public fault line. What had once been whispered behind closed doors now flared in the open, and the whole town was forced to pick a side. After Elliot's outburst, the hall hung heavy with silence, the kind that pressed down like a ship's anchor in rough seas. Every cough, every shuffle of feet felt amplified in the void. Mr. Tate, president of the Fishermen's Association, cleared his throat and stepped to the microphone. His words landed with the weight of duty. My father would join the stage to take part in the pinning ceremony, to place the eagle insignia that marked my new rank. My father rose stiffly, every eye in the room following him as he walked forward. When the small box was placed in his hands, I caught the tremor that ran through his fingers. For a moment, his gaze drifted, past me, past the crowd, into some memory he couldn't shake. I imagined what he saw. My mother in our kitchen years ago, standing between us, telling him to let me choose my own path. Still, he tried to resist, leaning toward his closest friends. His voice dropped to a rasp. Just a show, nothing more. A few heard it, their expressions faltering, but there was no stopping what came next. He lifted the eagle and pressed it against the velvet board. The pin slid into place with a soft snap, and the hall froze. The only sound was the ceiling fan's tired whine, spinning above us like a reminder of time itself. In that moment, my father was no longer the man in control of the story. He had become what he had always refused to be, just another witness, forced to acknowledge a truth he could not bend. The silence cracked when Elliot leapt back to his feet, his voice sharper than a blade. Her military career is nothing but paperwork. Lawyers, real lawyers, are the ones who defend justice. His words sliced through the air, and I saw my father's head bob in agreement, a faint nod as if to seal his son's verdict. Then came a sound I didn't expect. A chair scraped back, and an old veteran rose. His face was a map of scars and weather, his hands shaking slightly as he leaned on the table, but his voice, low, gravelly, carried clear. I saw her save men in Afghanistan. That's justice, too. He tapped his mug twice against the table. Cack! Cack! The sound rang like a gavel, final and unyielding. The effect was immediate. Pastor Miller breathed out an unplanned amen. A few fishermen nodded in agreement. Others removed their caps and held them to their chests. The shift was visible, a tide turning not because I defended myself, but because the truth had been claimed by people who had no reason to lie. I stayed still, my breath even, my coin warm in my palm. I didn't need to say a word. The room was speaking for me. My father tried for a smile, but it trembled at the edges. Elliot's face darkened, his fists curling tight, fury rolling off him in waves. Yet around them, the town no longer looked their way. Revenge, when it came, was quiet. It wasn't mine to declare. It was the community's verdict, plain and undeniable. In their silence and their nods, my father and brother were pushed to the edges, outsiders in their own story. And for the first time, I stood in the center, unchallenged. General Duval stepped up to the microphone, her posture as unshakable as the stars stitched into her shoulder boards. Her voice carried through the hall with clarity that left no space for doubt. By authority of the United States Air Force Personnel Center, Colonel Isolde Harriman is hereby recognized. The opening bars of the national anthem rose, and the room followed instinctively. Chairs scraped back. Men and women stood tall. Old fishermen, who had never set foot on a parade ground, removed their caps with trembling hands. Their chests expanded and tightened under palms pressed firm, the reverence plain in every bowed head. Near the stage, the frame of my mother's photograph rested on a small table, lit by a single candle. Eleanor's smile, soft and steady, looked out over the gathering as though she herself had orchestrated this night. My gaze locked on hers, and for a moment it felt as if she was there beside me, her whisper threading through the music, "Don't let him make you small." Then it was my father's turn. They handed him the eagle insignia, silver glint catching the light. His hand shook as he reached forward, fingers brushing the edge of my uniform. Slowly, he pinned it to my chest. He lowered his head, and the words slipped out, thin and broken, nothing like the boastful man who had mocked me hours earlier. "Well, I'll be—" The silence that followed was weightier than any applause, until it cracked open and the hall erupted in clapping, long, sustained, undeniable. It rolled over me like a tide. I didn't need to speak, didn't need to defend or explain. The truth was already standing tall in that room, and my father, the man who had spent a lifetime dismissing me, had just become the unwilling witness to it. When the ceremony ended and the crowd thinned, my father tugged at my sleeve, steering me toward a shadowed corner of the hall. His voice was low, carefully measured, as though control alone could repair what had just unraveled. "Let's take a photo for Facebook. Show we're good." I held his gaze, steady as I had on battlefields. "No," I said. "Let it be what it was. This town heard the truth tonight." Elliot's face darkened. Without a word, he stormed out, shoulders stiff, refusing even a backward glance. My father stood rooted, his head bowed, no quick joke left to offer. For the first time, he looked small to me, not because I wanted him diminished, but because the weight of pretending had finally slipped from my shoulders. Later that night, the salt wind stung my skin as I walked the path to the seaside cemetery. The Atlantic's breath was sharp, restless, like the memories that still lived in me. I knelt before my mother's stone, the carved letters of her name catching the moonlight. From my pocket, I drew the challenge coin, warm from my hand, and laid it beside a folded strip of uniform cloth. "I did not make myself small," I whispered, the words falling into the night. The surf answered in a hush against the rocks, the sound like her voice carried back to me, steady, sure, forgiving. Revenge, I realized, wasn't in shaming my father. It was in drawing the boundary he could never cross again, and standing tall inside it. The diner smelled of burnt coffee and sizzling bacon, the kind of place where nothing fancy was needed to feel like home. I sat across from General Duval in a cracked vinyl booth, the steam from our mugs rising between us. Pancakes soaked in butter sat cooling on the plates. She lifted her cup, her eyes steady on mine. "Revenge isn't fireworks," she said. "It's keeping your story, not letting others write it." I let the words settle, feeling something I hadn't in years. Peace seeping in, quiet and unforced. For once, I wasn't bracing for the next remark, the next dismissal, the next battle to prove myself. I simply nodded. A few hours later, I loaded my bag into the back seat of my car and drove out of New Bedford. The morning sun spread across the harbor, gilding the masts and rooftops in a soft, forgiving light. Gulls dipped low over the water, their cries sharp but free, and the tide lapped against the piers as though the town itself was exhaling. Behind the wheel, I let the truth form clearly in my chest. Important isn't a guest list. It's the quiet truth lived out loud. For the first time, revenge didn't mean crushing my father under the weight of his own words. It meant stepping beyond them, walking into the day unburdened, no longer defined by his shadow, but by the strength I carried in my own.